throughout the fill of this Pictish building, we've been recovering evidence of metalworking. Higher up there was a hearth that was definitely associated with blacksmithing, but also we've been finding crucible fragments, which are the clay ceramic vessels, probably no bigger than a small mug most of the time, used to melt copper alloy. So when we came down onto, this is the final floor, and although it is very uneven, it is really important to stress that it would have been smooth and level, because if you're walking around with a crucible of molten alloy which melts at 1,000 degrees, you don't want to be tripping over tumble or anything like that. So the whole thing is slumped, and you can see how it's been moving because of this building underneath. So forget the fact that it's very uneven, it would have been a very even floor, so we've got parts of the floor that survive better than other parts. What we've been able to do is, first of all, that copper alloy working is present on a lot of sites, but it's mostly in terms of 1 or 2 crucible fragments. We're probably heading towards 50, which is a significant amount. And the importance of it, that as this is a Pictish building, we would expect the alloys to be used in this Pictish building to be typically tin bronzes with a little bit of lead. So that's copper and tin with a little bit of lead. As a brief chronology of copper alloys, if you start to look across the Iron Age of Britain as a whole, then copper, tin with a little bit of lead is the common alloying used throughout the late Iron Age. In southern Britain, when the Romans arrived, they also bring lots of other alloys, in particular the brasses, which is copper and zinc, and then you get what we call gun metals and all sorts of things with coppers, tin, zinc, lead, all mixed in. And that runs through the Roman period, and then starts to decline towards the end of the Roman period. Some of those artifacts make their way north, so we do find copper alloy Roman artifacts across Scotland. At the end of the Roman Empire, then the reason is that a lot of that brass is coming from the Near East, and with the sort of the turmoil of the end of the Roman Empire, all those trade routes tend to break up. So what we see in southern Britain in the post-Roman period, into the Saxon period, we then return to the copper, tin and lead. There are still some brasses around, and if you go and look at the Coppergate helmet, which is Anglian, then the nose piece is brass on that. And the reason for that is they're using it very sparingly, and the important thing about it is its colour, because the brass can virtually be gold-like. So that's why they're using these different copper alloys. So we know that there's a little bit of brass around. And then what we see, say, at Coppergate, York, which is when you see you see a very distinct Viking horizon coming in, we see the return of the brasses, the copper and zincs. That's because the Vikings have reopened those trade routes into the Near East and are moving this copper alloy around. So when we came to analyse the crucibles using X-ray fluorescence, we're finding that in fact the majority of these crucibles have zinc in them. And that's always problematic, because these alloys melt at 1,000 degrees Celsius, but zinc boils at 9–10 degrees Celsius. So when you melt a crucible of brass, you actually have zinc fume coming off, which produces a lovely green flame, and then that oxidizes to a white powder. So if we have brass being melted in crucibles here, we have effectively 2 or 3 options. One option to dismiss immediately is the idea that this is old Roman brass that has been collected. A smith does not sit up in Rousay waiting for somebody to turn up with a bag of Roman brass they happen to have found somewhere in Scotland to say, can you make me something? The smiths required a constant and assured supply both of metal in terms of ingots and fuel. The second option, another option, is that we're wrong, and in fact they are using much more brass than we think. We've got some material from cairns which hopefully will dispel that opinion permanently. Another option is that we tend to think here of, as it were, the Picts being here, and then suddenly, as it were, the Vikings coming over this way. Well, why not turn it round a little bit and say maybe the Picts had contact with Scandinavia, and maybe they picked up a little bit of brass on the way back. or the most strongest possibility is that it's actually a Viking smith coming in and utilising this building for copper alloy working. Now, on all sites, we have here ironworking, and we expect to find ironworking because it is the essential craft. All the other crafts, be that shipbuilding, agriculture, forestry, woodworking, carpentry, you name it, relies on the blacksmith, the ironsmith, to produce the edge tools. That means ones with cutting edges to carry out their craft. So a blacksmith is absolutely essential. What is different about this smithy is that it is virtually wholly a coppersmith's workshop. Now we know that partly from the crucible fragments that we've just got, these copper zinc alloys being melted, but we've XRF'd the ground around it, and we're finding the highest concentrations of copper and zinc over in here. So we know that the stuff, because of this volatility, it will fall into the soil as well. So effectively the soil is contaminated with copper and zinc. So we know that there's copper and zinc working around here. We've got the two anvil stones, the large one and then the small one. And around the small one we also have a lot of hammer scale. This is fine flakes. When the smith is working hammering iron, little bits oxidize off. They look a little bit like fish scales, and they fall around the anvil. All the other sort of macro slags and other things tend to get carried out and transported away. And in fact, I suspect when you plot out the finds of crucibles, we'll find them more at the sort of the periphery, where they're sort of being kicked to the side. So this means that this is a coppersmith who's doing a little bit of ironworking, perhaps using working with bits of iron that have been decorated with copper alloy, dipped in copper alloy, as part of his or her craft. So we can position the smith here, heating the crucibles in the fire. The bellows, because you'd need bellows to get the heat going up, are probably on that side, that we suspect those stones there are actually the pads of the bellows. And then with a little bit of blacksmithing going on there. Another thing that Steve mentioned, the staircase. What's interesting is that it curves round. And the reason for that, I suspect, is that it blocks more light coming out, because it's essential in a smithy to have very low light levels. Yesterday, and you're going to be rewarded for the work we did yesterday later on, we excavated a modern smithy, and again it was actually quite difficult to do because it was dark, and so it's essential so that the smiths can see the colour of the flame and the colour of the metals. So with the stairs curving round, it blocks the light falling into the building. What else have we got? Anything else? What else have we got? Oh yes. The final point is that this is a coppersmith's workshop with a little bit of ironworking. We would normally expect that only to occur in urban settlements. As far as off the top of my head, I can't think of another, in a sense, rural settlement that has just a coppersmith's workshop. So that has major implications for the status of this site, because it means that the occupants of this site could maintain a smith dedicated to copper working, i.e. producing decorative jewellery, etc., as well as presumably a blacksmith somewhere else. So it really raises the status of this site to very, very high levels, possibly unparalleled. And I think that's about it, at the moment. Anything?
Just to pick up from what you're saying there,